When the cameras began to roll in early Hollywood, the world believed it was witnessing the birth of a dream factory, a place where beauty conquered struggle and fame erased all fear. But beneath the glimmering surface of Tinseltown's golden age, another empire was quietly expanding. One built not on art, but on fear, silence, and control. The 1930s to the 1960s marked a strange and dangerous marriage. The union between Hollywood stars and America's most ruthless crime syndicates. While audiences flocked to theaters for escapism, mobsters saw opportunity. They didn't crave applause. They wanted control over unions, casinos, nightclubs, and even the lives of those who entertained millions. Hollywood became their stage. The bright lights of premieres blinded the public from the shadows lurking just beyond them. Behind the smiles and champagne, there were whispered deals. Producers who paid protection money, studio heads who looked the other way, and actors who attended parties they couldn't refuse. In the smoky lounges of Beverly Hills, the mob met the movies. Gangsters rubbed shoulders with directors and stars, sharing drinks, stories, and sometimes threats. The line between fiction and reality began to blur. When a crime boss dined at the same table as an A-lister, who really held the power? This was not the Hollywood of fairy tales. It was a place where careers were made with handshakes and ended with gunshots. Fame offered no immunity. In this world, the mob didn't need to write scripts. They were already producing tragedies far more shocking than anything that could be filmed. And as we step behind the velvet curtains into those decades when fear wore a tuxedo and charm hit a pistol, we uncover the stories of those who dared to dance too close to the mob's fire and paid for it in blood. Because in old Hollywood, some deals weren't signed in ink. They were signed in shadows. Sammy Davis Jr., the mob's favorite performer. Before he was a legend, he was a miracle. Sammy Davis Jr. could sing, dance, and act with a brilliance that seemed almost superhuman. Born into a family of vaudeville performers, he stepped onto a stage before most children could even write their names. By the 1950s, he had become one of America's most electrifying entertainers, a man whose smile could light up the darkest room. But the rooms he performed in were not always safe, because the same spotlights that celebrated him also cast the shadow of the mob. Las Vegas was the jewel of post-war America. Neon, champagne, and endless applause. But every stage, every casino, every paycheck was owned or protected by the Mafia. And for a black entertainer in that era, success came with an unspoken rule. The mob decides how far you go. Sammy rose alongside the Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, men who defined cool. Together, they filled mob-run casinos with laughter and song. On stage, they were gods. Off stage, they were puppets. The mob controlled everything. The ticket sales, the contracts, the bookings, the hotel suites. Sammy knew it. Everyone did. But he had learned early in life that survival meant playing the game. Then came the affair that changed everything. In 1957, Sammy Davis Jr. fell in love with Kim Novak, a white actress under contract with Columbia Pictures, one of the most beloved women in Hollywood. Their relationship was secret, fragile, and doomed. Because when word reached Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss who had business ties to the studio, his fury was instant. An interracial relationship in that era wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. According to friends and insiders, Giancana ordered a warning: marry a black woman within days or die. Terrified, Sammy complied. He hastily wed Lorraine White, a black dancer, in a staged ceremony arranged to appease the mob. The marriage lasted only a few months, but the damage lingered for the rest of his life. Sammy had seen what happened to people who disobeyed the mob. He kept smiling for the cameras, joking on stage about having friends in low places. But behind the charm there was fear, the kind that never left. As the years passed, he amassed fortune and fame, performing for presidents and kings. But he was never truly free. The mob owned his bookings, his casinos, even some of his debts. He once confided to a friend, "I can make $1 million on stage and still owe somebody after the show." By the time he died in 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. was celebrated as an American icon. But those close to him knew he had lived most of his life under invisible chains. The mob didn't kill him with bullets or bombs. They didn't have to. They controlled him through fear, a quieter, crueler weapon that never missed. For Hollywood, Sammy's story revealed a darker truth. Sometimes the mob didn't need to take your life. They just needed to own it. And even in death, when fans remembered his smile and his rhythm, there was something tragic in the silence between the beats. A rhythm the mob had forced him to dance to all along. Dino Bravo, fame meets firepower. He wasn't a Hollywood actor. He wasn't a singer or a film producer. But Dino Bravo, the Canadian wrestling superstar, embodied everything that made the mob's reach so terrifying. The way it could pull anyone, even heroes of the crowd, into its world of blood and silence. For millions of fans in the 1980s, Dino Bravo was a national icon. The strong man of Quebec, the muscle-bound showman who could lift opponents above his head as arenas thundered with applause. He was charisma and power rolled into one, a man who seemed invincible beneath the bright lights. But fame fades quickly in the world of entertainment. And when the cheers died down, Dino discovered what so many before him had learned. Stardom pays in applause, not security. By the early 1990s, wrestling had changed. New stars had replaced him, and the lavish lifestyle he'd built, the mansions, the cars, the image, came with debts that no fan adoration could pay. Desperate to maintain it all, Dino looked for opportunity outside the ring, and in Montreal, that path often led to the mob. At first, it was just business. The black market cigarette trade was booming, a lucrative racket controlled by organized crime families who operated between Canada and the United States. Dino's fame opened doors, earned trust, and helped move merchandise quietly. He wasn't the first celebrity to drift into that world, and he wouldn't be the last. But greed and loyalty don't coexist for long in the underworld. Rumors began to spread, whispers that Dino had skimmed money, or that he'd seen too much, learned too many names. The mob doesn't forgive curiosity. On March 11, 1993, Dino Bravo's wife and daughter returned home to find a nightmare. He was slumped in his armchair, television still on, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder. He had been shot 17 times, eight in the head and chest, a signature execution that left no doubt who was responsible. There was no robbery, no struggle, nothing taken except a man's life. The police called it a professional hit. The mob called it closure. To the public, the news was incomprehensible. How could a beloved athlete, a man who once embodied pride and strength, end up a casualty in the war of organized crime? For the entertainment world, Dino's murder was something even more chilling. Proof that the Mafia's shadow stretched far beyond Hollywood's sound stages. No spotlight could outshine it, no fame could outlive it. In the end, Dino Bravo's greatest performance wasn't in an arena, it was the illusion he lived, that fame could protect him from the darkness that financed it. The crowd's cheers had faded long before the gunfire began, and as investigators packed up the scene, one truth became clear. In the mob's world, no one retires alive. Loretta Young, the actress who lived under a silent threat. Under the floodlights of Hollywood's golden age, Loretta Young seemed untouchable. She was the picture of grace, porcelain skin, luminous eyes, a voice that could melt even the coldest heart. She won an Academy Award, starred alongside Clark Gable and Tyrone Power, and embodied the purity that the studio system so carefully manufactured. To audiences, she was the dream. But in truth, she was living inside a nightmare, one she could never speak of. Behind the elegance of that era, the studios were ruled not just by producers and directors, but by men whose power came from elsewhere, men whose money smelled of smoke and blood. The Mafia didn't need to appear in Hollywood credits. They appeared in the contracts. They funded movies, controlled distribution, managed unions, and decided which stars would rise and which would quietly disappear. Loretta Young learned early that fame came with conditions. The studio owned her name, her image, her reputation, and somewhere in that web of contracts, the mob owned the studio. She was careful, disciplined, deeply religious. She avoided scandals, refused to drink, and lived with a near-obsessive dedication to propriety. But even that could not protect her from the whispers. Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s was not a place of freedom for women. It was a chessboard. And the players who controlled it, executives, fixers, gangsters, expected loyalty and silence. Loretta's beauty and fame made her valuable, but it also made her vulnerable. She once confided to a close friend that she was terrified of powerful men, though she never named them. In those circles, names could be fatal. She witnessed careers destroyed overnight, contracts canceled for women who resisted advances or defied the wrong people. Rumors spread about actresses who'd vanished after angering mob-connected producers, sent to rehab or Europe, or simply erased from the industry's memory. And Loretta, ever the professional, stayed quiet. She built a reputation for perfection. Never late, never difficult, never political. Her silence became her shield, but that silence came at a price. After her retirement, she lived a quiet life, far from the chaos of Los Angeles, surrounded by family and faith. Yet even then, she refused to discuss the darker side of the system that had made her a star. When asked in interviews about the rumors of mob influence in Hollywood, she would smile gently and change the subject. To the end, she carried herself with dignity, but also with distance, as if still protecting secrets too dangerous to name. Loretta Young's story was not about crime, but about survival. She didn't die in a hail of bullets or a burst of scandal. She endured, and in that endurance was something quietly heroic. A woman navigating a world designed to break her. Her final years were spent in peace, yet her legacy remains haunted by the question she could never answer. How much of her life had been hers, and how much had been scripted by others? Because even for the most radiant stars of Hollywood's golden age, the light didn't always belong to them. Sometimes it belonged to the shadows, and the shadows never let go. Virginia Hill, the queen of the mob. With her fiery red hair, sharp wit, and unshakable confidence, Virginia Hill was unlike anyone Hollywood had ever seen. She could glide into a room full of movie stars and make them look ordinary. Because she wasn't just a socialite. She was the bridge between two empires, the golden world of Hollywood and the blood-soaked kingdom of organized crime. Virginia came from nothing. Born in Alabama, she clawed her way to power through charm, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to make dangerous men trust her. By the 1940s, she had become one of the most important couriers for the Chicago outfit, moving cash, secrets, and influence between mob families, casinos, and studios. She knew everyone who mattered, and everyone who mattered wanted to be near her. To actors, she was fascinating, mysterious, worldly, glamorous. To mobsters, she was essential, the woman who kept their money clean and their mouths shut. But there was one man who saw her as more than a tool, Bugsy Siegel. Their affair was electric and volatile. Together, they embodied the strange marriage between crime and celebrity, attending premieres one night, discussing mob finances the next. Siegel trusted her completely. She was the last person to see him alive. When Siegel was gunned down in her Beverly Hills home in 1947, the shock rippled across America. Police arrived to find her missing. She had vanished, leaving behind blood, broken glass, and questions that no one dared to answer. Had she known the hit was coming? Had she been part of it? Or had she been marked for death the moment Bugsy's body hit the floor? For a while, Virginia played the survivor. She drifted through Europe, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, living lavishly, always looking over her shoulder. The newspapers wrote about her designer gowns and luxury hotels, but behind the perfume and pearls, there was fear. Friends said she became paranoid. She refused to sit with her back to a door. She kept her luggage packed, ready to leave at a moment's notice. By the mid-1960s, the glamour had faded. Her money was gone, her connections severed. She was living alone in Salzburg, Austria, under a sky that seemed to close in on her. On March 24, 1966, Virginia Hill's story ended in silence. Her body was found in the snow behind her small home. The official cause, suicide by overdose. But those who had known her didn't believe it. Too many enemies, too many secrets, too many men who wanted her gone. Some said the mob had finally come to collect. Others whispered that she had been silenced for what she knew. Names, deals, and the hidden connections between Hollywood's brightest faces and the underworld that financed them. Whatever the truth, Virginia Hill's death felt less like a mystery and more like a message. For decades, Hollywood women had been controlled by contracts, by studios, by men in power. But Virginia Hill had danced in all those worlds and refused to bow to any of them. In the end, that defiance may have cost her everything. When her story faded from headlines, Hollywood moved on, pretending she'd never existed. But her shadow lingered, a ghost in mink and diamonds, reminding everyone that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the gangster with the gun, but the woman who knew every secret. Virginia Hill's life was a movie that could never be made, because the ending was too real and the truth was too dangerous. Bugsy Siegel, the blueprint of a bloody dream. He was charming, handsome, and utterly fearless. To Hollywood's elite, Bugsy Siegel wasn't a gangster. He was a celebrity. He dressed better than most leading men, spoke with a silver tongue, and moved through Beverly Hills parties as if he owned them. But Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was no actor. He was one of the most dangerous men ever to walk the streets of Los Angeles. A man who brought the Mafia's invisible empire right into Hollywood's heart. Siegel began his rise on the rough streets of Brooklyn, a killer with ambition burning behind his blue eyes. He co-founded Murder Inc., the mob's enforcement arm, a network of assassins who carried out hits for the nation's most powerful crime families. But Bugsy wanted more than blood money. He wanted glamour, fame, legitimacy. When he came west in the 1930s, Los Angeles welcomed him with open arms. Stars adored him. Directors courted his friendship. At dinner parties, he was magnetic. A man who could tell stories of danger and death with a smile that made people forget who he truly was. He became a bridge between two worlds, the dreamers of Hollywood and the killers of the underworld. His most ambitious dream was the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, a luxury oasis in the desert meant to attract the Hollywood elite. Siegel poured millions into it, promising a paradise of neon and fortune. The problem? The money wasn't all his. It belonged to the mob. And when the construction costs ballooned, rumors spread that Bugsy was skimming off the top. At first, his charm protected him. No one wanted to believe that their glittering friend could be in danger. But loyalty in the Mafia isn't a shield. It's a test. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel sat in the Beverly Hills home of his mistress, Virginia Hill, reading the newspaper. The night was calm. Then came the shattering sound of gunfire. Bullets tore through the window, striking him in the head and chest. His body slumped across the sofa, eyes still open, wide, blue, and lifeless. Hollywood froze. The man they had toasted, the man who made danger look beautiful, was dead, executed with surgical precision. It was called the first drive-by shooting in Beverly Hills history. Newspapers splashed his bloodied face across front pages. Behind closed doors, stars whispered, "If Bugsy could be killed, who among them was truly safe?" Bugsy Siegel's death wasn't just the end of one man. It was the end of an illusion. The moment Hollywood realized that its glamorous playground had been built atop a foundation of crime, greed, and fear. His legacy lived on, not in the movies he inspired, but in the lesson he left behind. The mob could touch anyone, even the people the world adored most. Johnny Stompanato, the lover who brought fear to Hollywood. He looked like he had stepped straight out of a movie poster. Tall, dark-haired, immaculately dressed. Women were drawn to him. Men wanted to be him. But Johnny Stompanato wasn't a movie star. He was a gangster who learned to play the part. A former boxer turned enforcer for Los Angeles mob boss Mickey Cohen, Johnny moved in circles most men never dared approach. He appeared at Hollywood parties, drove expensive cars, and spoke with the easy confidence of someone who feared nothing. To the public, he was mysterious. To those who truly knew him, he was terrifying. His charm found its way to one of Hollywood's brightest lights. Lana Turner, the silver screen goddess whose beauty had defined an era. To fans, their relationship looked like a fairy tale. They graced red carpets arm in arm, smiled for cameras, and filled gossip columns with tales of passion and romance. But behind the locked doors of Turner's Beverly Hills mansion, the story turned violent. Johnny's temper was legendary. He controlled Lana's every move, her clothes, her friends, her career. He would explode in jealous rages, hurling insults and threats that made even the fearless actress tremble. There were bruises she covered with makeup, tears hidden behind sunglasses, and phone calls she never dared to make. Those close to her said Johnny often reminded Lana who truly owned her, and that if she ever left him, no one in Hollywood would ever hire her again. By the spring of 1958, Lana was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Then came the night that would haunt her forever. It was April 4th. The argument began like countless others. Raised voices, slamming doors, a desperate plea for control. In the next room, Cheryl Crane, Lana's teenage daughter, listened in horror as her mother screamed. Something inside her broke. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and burst into the bedroom. In one terrified instant, she plunged the blade into Stampanato's stomach. He staggered back, eyes wide, gasping for air, and then collapsed. By the time police arrived, he was dead. The scandal exploded across every front page in America. Hollywood star's boyfriend stabbed. Gangster dead in Turner home. The tabloids feasted. The studios panicked. Lana Turner wept on the witness stand, trembling as the coroner ruled the death-justifiable homicide, an act of self-defense by a frightened child. But in the smoky corners of Los Angeles, whispers told a different story. Had the mob allowed Johnny's death, even ordered it? Had he crossed someone more powerful than himself, and the chaos at Lana's mansion merely provided a convenient ending? No one ever proved it, but for Hollywood, the message was unmistakable. Even love, that most human of emotions, could become a weapon in the mob's game of control. Lana Turner's career never fully recovered. She lived under the shadow of that night for the rest of her life, and Johnny Stompanato became a legend, not for the films he never made, but for the fear he brought into Hollywood's most beautiful home. Albert Anastasia, the barber chair execution. The morning was quiet. The hum of Manhattan traffic mixed with the scent of shaving cream and cigarette smoke. Inside the Park Sheraton Hotel, a man sat in a barber chair, eyes half closed, a towel draped across his shoulders. To the other customers, he looked calm, another businessman enjoying his morning trim. But this wasn't an ordinary man. It was Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the most feared killer in America. For more than 2 decades, Anastasia had been death's middleman, the founder of Murder, Inc., the mob's enforcement arm that carried out hundreds of assassinations. If someone crossed the Mafia, Albert's men made sure they disappeared. Quickly, quietly, and permanently. He was the embodiment of cold efficiency. He didn't just order killings. He often joined in himself. He once told a lieutenant, "If I don't see the eyes, I don't believe he's dead." Hollywood loved him. From a distance, writers and directors whispered his name, inspired by his legend. The image of the emotionless assassin, loyal only to death, became a cinematic archetype. But what Hollywood didn't see was how that legend would end, and how it would haunt every gangster movie ever made. By the mid-1950s, Anastasia ruled the Gambino crime family with iron precision. But power breeds paranoia. He made enemies, too many of them. His unpredictable temper and disregard for the commission's authority turned allies into conspirators. And when he started claiming profits that weren't his, the bosses decided it was time for the executioner to be executed. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton for his usual shave. He trusted routine. Routine felt safe. It wasn't. As the barber leaned over to lather his face, 2 masked men stormed in. They said nothing. They simply opened fire. Bullets shattered mirrors and glass. Anastasia, confused, tried to rise, perhaps thinking the reflections were his attackers. He lunged toward the mirror, striking at his own image before collapsing in a pool of blood. The entire assault lasted less than 10 seconds. When police arrived, the scene looked like something out of a crime film. Blood splattered across the walls, a razor still buzzing on the counter, and Anastasia's body draped awkwardly over the chair. The photo made the front page of every newspaper in America. Hollywood couldn't resist. Within a decade, the image of a man killed mid-shave became one of the most repeated scenes in mob cinema, from The Godfather to Goodfellas to Casino. But the truth was far less glamorous. Anastasia's death wasn't about betrayal or tragedy. It was about balance. The mob doesn't allow legends to outshine its order. And so, the man who had perfected the art of killing died performing the simplest act of trust, letting someone touch his throat with a blade. In a way, it was poetic. The executioner, undone by routine. The killer, struck down while unarmed. The man who lived by death, finally caught by it. For Hollywood, it was another reminder that reality doesn't need a screenwriter. It writes its own endings, often in the same red ink. Sam Giancana, the man who bridged the White House and the underworld. By the 1950s, the Mafia was no longer hiding in alleyways or smoky backrooms. It was wearing tailored suits, dining with senators, and whispering into the ears of movie stars. And at the center of this powerful web stood one man, Sam Mooney Giancana, the gangster who connected the mob to both Hollywood and Washington, D.C. To the press, he was charming, a man who smiled easily and tipped extravagantly. To the underworld, he was pure fear. Giancana ran the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful criminal empires in America. He controlled casinos, unions, and politicians. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his money. It was his connections. In Las Vegas, he financed casinos that became playgrounds for the stars. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and the legendary Rat Pack performed in mob-owned rooms where the drinks were free, the laughter loud, and the surveillance constant. To the public, it looked like showbiz magic. To those inside, it was a house built on blood money. Giancana's reach extended far beyond entertainment. Rumors swirled that he had helped fund political campaigns, that he had influence over the Kennedy family, and that his connections stretched all the way to the White House. His rumored relationship with Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in America, only deepened the mystique. Was it love or leverage? Those who got too close to Giancana often ended up paying the price. He was known to be mercurial, one day a generous host, the next a man who could order a death with a single phone call. But in the 1970s, even Giancana began to feel the walls closing in. Federal investigators were circling, building cases that could finally expose the mob's ties to Hollywood, Las Vegas, and government power. Giancana was called to testify before grand juries. Behind the scenes, whispers spread. He was ready to talk. And for a man like him, that was a death sentence. On the night of June 19, 1975, in his home in Oak Park, Illinois, Sam Giancana prepared a simple dinner, a plate of sausage and peppers. He was alone, comfortable, unguarded. Sometime between the meal and the midnight hour, someone slipped inside. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, just 7 gunshots, each one precise. When police arrived, they found Giancana's body slumped near the stove, the food still warm, the silence absolute. Hollywood reacted with shock, and then silence. He was the man who had partied with Sinatra, whispered with Monroe, and, some said, shaped the outcome of an American election. If someone like him could be executed in his own kitchen, what did that mean for everyone else who had touched his world? The message was clear. There was no such thing as too powerful, too famous, or too connected. When the mob decided your time was up, even your walls couldn't protect you. Giancana's murder remains unsolved. The official files are still filled with blanks, redacted pages, and missing evidence. But in the corridors of Hollywood and the smoky casinos of Las Vegas, the whispers never stopped. Some said he was silenced by the mob. Others insisted it was a government cleanup, a warning to anyone who thought of talking. Whatever the truth, Sam Giancana's death ended an era, the brief, glittering illusion that Hollywood and the mob could coexist without consequence. Because when glamour shares a table with power, one of them always gets eaten. Anthony Spilotro, the desert executioner. If Bugsy Siegel had been the mob's architect in the West, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro was its executioner. He didn't build empires, he buried them. By the 1970s, Las Vegas had evolved into the mob's greatest masterpiece. a city where glamour and greed coexisted under the same neon sky. The casinos sparkled, the money flowed, and Hollywood stars arrived nightly to perform, gamble, or simply be seen. But beneath the champagne and sequins, the Chicago outfit ruled everything, and Spilotro was their iron hand. He was short, stocky, with cold, unreadable eyes. A man whose smile meant nothing and whose loyalty meant death. As the mob's enforcer in Las Vegas, Spilotro's job was simple: protect the boss's money and eliminate anyone who threatened it. He ran the Hole in the Wall gang, a crew that specialized in robberies, extortion, and retribution. When someone owed the mob, Spilotro collected in blood. Hollywood strangely admired him. His reputation fascinated screenwriters and directors. His name circulated in back rooms, inspiring characters who would later appear in films like Casino. Some even sought his advice, asking him to verify the realism of gangster scenes. He'd laugh, correct their dialogue, and pour another drink, knowing that none of them truly understood what the real thing looked like. But the higher Spilotro climbed, the more dangerous he became. He started drawing attention. Headlines, investigations, enemies. His violent temper and taste for fame made him unpredictable, a liability in an organization built on silence. The Chicago bosses began to whisper that Tony was no longer working for them. He was working against them. By 1986, the decision had been made. In the mob, there are no warnings, only endings. On June 14, 1986, Spilotro and his brother Michael were called to a meeting in Bensenville, Illinois. It was supposed to be a reconciliation with the higher-ups, a chance to smooth things over. The brothers arrived dressed neatly, expecting conversation. They never walked out again. Days later, 2 bodies were discovered buried in an Indiana cornfield. They had been beaten savagely, their faces unrecognizable, their ribs shattered, their bodies dumped like trash. Autopsy reports revealed the final horror. They had been buried alive. The news sent shockwaves through the underworld and through Hollywood. Because by then, Spilotro had become more than a gangster. He was a myth, the real-life embodiment of the characters that crime films worshipped. His death proved that even legends of violence were still mortal in the mob's eyes. When Martin Scorsese later made Casino, he immortalized Spilotro through the character of Nicky Santoro, played by Joe Pesci. The movie captured his rise, his rage, and his gruesome fall. But even that depiction couldn't match the brutality of the truth. Tony the Ant died as he lived, violently, without mercy, and without glory. The desert that had once glittered with money and fame became his graveyard. For Hollywood, his end blurred the final line between cinema and reality. Because when a man like Spilotro dies in a way so cinematic that it inspires a film decades later, you start to wonder, did Hollywood imitate the mob, or did the mob imitate Hollywood? The man who vanished into nothing, Jimmy Hoffa. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the mob's shadow no longer stopped at the doors of Hollywood. It stretched across America's boardrooms, casinos, and unions, pulling the strings of everything from film financing to presidential campaigns. And at the center of that tangled web stood one man, a legend of labor, power, and mystery, Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa wasn't an actor, but he played a role better than any star. He was a working-class hero, the man who fought for truck drivers, built the Teamsters Union into a financial powerhouse, and wielded more influence than some senators. But his power came with a price. The union's pension funds became the mob's private bank, financing construction projects, casinos, and even films. In return, the Mafia protected Hoffa until they didn't. He was loud, ambitious, and stubborn, a man who didn't know how to back down. When he was imprisoned in 1967 for jury tampering and fraud, the world assumed it was the end of his story. But in 1971, after serving 4 years, he walked free, determined to reclaim control of the Teamsters. The problem? The mob had moved on. They had new deals, new allies, and no room for a man who knew too much. FBI wiretaps later suggested Hoffa was threatening to expose their secrets, their laundering networks, their political deals, even their connections to Hollywood studios that had quietly taken mob-backed loans. To some, Hoffa had become a liability. To others, he was a man with a death wish. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa drove to a restaurant in suburban Detroit, the Machis Red Fox, for a meeting with two trusted associates. He told his wife he'd be home for dinner. He never came back. His car was found in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition. There were no witnesses, no body, no blood. Jimmy Hoffa had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The search that followed became one of the most exhaustive in FBI history. They dug up empty fields, demolished garages, drained lakes, and even tore apart stadium foundations, all chasing rumors that never led anywhere. The case became a legend, a black hole of conspiracy theories. Some said he was buried beneath a New Jersey football field. Others believed he was cremated in a mob-owned furnace, and a few swore he was still alive, hidden away under a false identity. But those who truly knew the mob's code didn't need a body to understand the truth. When someone knows too much, disappearance is the cleanest form of execution. For Hollywood, Hoffa's vanishing act wasn't just a news story, it was a mirror, because the same silence that swallowed him had once kept so many other crimes buried beneath red carpets and bright lights. Bugsy Siegel, Johnny Stompanato, Virginia Hill, Sal Mineo, Dino Bravo, Anthony Spilotro. Their stories all led here to this moment. A moment when even the most powerful man in America could be erased without a trace. And as the world searched for answers, a question lingered like cigarette smoke in a darkened room. If Jimmy Hoffa could disappear, who else had vanished? And what other secrets had Hollywood buried with them? Carmine Galante, the cigar king who choked on power. He was small in stature, but Carmine Galante carried himself like a king. The kind of king who didn't need a crown, just fear. To those who worked for him, he was the cigar. Always smoking, always scheming, always reminding everyone that he was the man in control. By the late 1970s, Galante was the undisputed head of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families that ruled New York's underworld. He had climbed his way to the top through sheer brutality. A man who believed violence wasn't a tool, but a language. He spoke it fluently. Unlike other bosses who preferred the shadows, Galante craved the spotlight. He dined in public, posed for photos, and mocked his rivals openly. His trademark cigar never left his lips. Not in meetings, not in restaurants, not even during hits. To the world, it became his symbol. To his enemies, it became his target. While others feared attention, Galante courted it. He believed he could outlive anyone, outsmart everyone. He took control of the heroin trade that flooded America's streets and kept the profits for himself. The other families wanted their share. Galante's response was simple: no. He ruled like a dictator, vicious, paranoid, untouchable. But arrogance is the one crime the mob never forgives. In the summer of 1979, Galante sat in the sun-drenched garden of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Brooklyn. It was supposed to be a quiet lunch with 2 loyal bodyguards, both Sicilians. He was relaxed, laughing, his cigar glowing between his teeth. Then came the sound of footsteps. 3 masked men entered through the back. No warning, no words, just gunfire. In seconds, the air filled with bullets and smoke. Galante was hit again and again, thrown back against his chair. When the police arrived, they found him sprawled across the patio, his cigar still clamped between his teeth, unlit, frozen in death. The photograph of his corpse became one of the most iconic images in mob history. A symbol of pride turned to tragedy, of a man so certain of his power that he died clutching the very thing that defined him. For Hollywood, it was the stuff of legend, the kind of ending that writers dream of and real men fear. The scene would later inspire countless gangster films: The Outdoor Cafe, The Sudden Betrayal, the slow tilt of the camera as the hero's empire collapses in a heartbeat. But the truth behind that image was more than cinematic. It was prophetic. Carmine Galante believed he was invincible. But in the mob, the moment you start believing your own myth, you've already signed your death warrant. The cigar king had choked, not on smoke, but on his own greed. Frank Rosenthal, the man who made Vegas a movie, before Martin Scorsese's Casino ever rolled a camera, Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal had already lived the movie. He was the original blueprint, the man who turned Las Vegas into a goldmine for the mob, and in the process became one of the most dangerously intelligent figures in American crime. Rosenthal wasn't a thug. He was a thinker, a numbers man who understood that greed could be organized. He started as a bookmaker in Chicago, running illegal gambling operations so smoothly that he caught the eye of the Chicago outfit, the same syndicate that had built empires from blood and whiskey. To them, Rosenthal wasn't just useful, he was revolutionary. In the 1960s and 70s, they sent him to Las Vegas, a city already glowing with neon sin, to manage their biggest investment, the Stardust, Fremont, and Hacienda casinos. His job was simple: keep the profits high, keep the law low, and keep the bosses rich. And Lefty did it better than anyone. He understood risk, timing, and showmanship. He ran his casinos like clockwork, elegant, disciplined, and profitable. To the public, he was a visionary. To the mob, he was a miracle worker. To the government, he was a problem they couldn't quite touch. But Frank Rosenthal had one fatal flaw. He liked being noticed. He began hosting his own TV talk show, The Frank Rosenthal Show, inviting celebrities, showgirls, and local big shots to chat under studio lights, all while secretly laundering mob money through the casinos he controlled. He became a star in his own right, a mob associate who looked more like a Hollywood producer than a criminal. And just like in Hollywood, fame brought enemies. By the early 1980s, federal investigators were closing in. Wiretaps buzzed with his name. Rival gangsters whispered that Lefty had grown too powerful, too visible. The Chicago bosses didn't like attention, and Frank was getting plenty. Then came the night that turned his story into legend, October 4th, 1982. Rosenthal left Tony Roma's restaurant in Las Vegas and slid into his Cadillac. As he turned the key, the world erupted. A car bomb detonated beneath him, a roaring explosion that tore through metal and glass. By sheer improbable luck, a steel plate under his driver's seat absorbed the blast, saving his life. The explosion that should have killed him became the miracle that made him immortal. He stumbled from the wreckage, dazed but alive, his suit singed, his face bloodied, his legend reborn. The message was clear. Someone wanted him erased. But even then, Rosenthal didn't talk. He packed his bags, left Las Vegas, and never returned. Hollywood couldn't resist his story. When Casino was released in 1995, Robert De Niro's Ace Rothstein was Frank Rosenthal. Meticulous, ambitious, betrayed by the system he helped build. But what the film only hinted at was the reality. Rosenthal's life wasn't just about money or power. It was about survival in a world where one wrong bet meant a closed casket. For decades after, he lived quietly in Florida, still watching, still calculating, still careful. He outlived nearly everyone who had wanted him dead. But the ghosts of Las Vegas, the money, the murders, the betrayals, never left him. When he died in 2008 of a heart attack, friends said he went peacefully, but others couldn't help noticing the irony. After surviving car bombs and mob vendettas, it was his own heart that finally stopped beating, perhaps from carrying too many secrets for too long. Frank Rosenthal turned Las Vegas into a movie, and the movie never stopped playing. Mickey Cohen, the gangster who became a celebrity. No one loved the spotlight quite like Mickey Cohen. He was the gangster who treated Los Angeles like his own personal film set. Part movie star, part menace, and all ambition. While others ruled from the shadows, Cohen stepped right into the light, grinning for cameras, giving interviews, and posing in custom suits as if violence were just another form of show business. Born in Brooklyn, raised on the streets, Mickey learned early that fists could earn fame faster than talent. He started as a boxer, a scrappy fighter with a taste for risk. But when the ring couldn't contain his hunger, he followed the money, straight into the mob's open arms. By the 1940s, Los Angeles was a city of dreams, and Cohen was its nightmare dressed in silk. When Bugsy Siegel was sent to the West Coast to oversee mob operations, Mickey became his right-hand man, the enforcer, the face, the man who made sure debts were paid and silence was kept. But when Siegel was murdered in 1947, Cohen didn't hide. He took over. He opened nightclubs that attracted movie stars and moguls alike. Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, Humphrey Bogart. They all passed through his doors. Reporters adored him. He'd pose beside expensive cars and laugh about the corruption everyone knew existed, but no one dared to print outright. He'd brag, "I own more cops than I can count." Hollywood couldn't look away. He was both terrifying and magnetic, a gangster who seemed to enjoy being famous for it. But underneath the bravado, Cohen was ruthless. He ran illegal gambling operations, extorted businesses, and moved drugs through Hollywood's most glamorous neighborhoods. Every dollar of his empire dripped with intimidation. Those who defied him didn't get second chances. Still, he played the part of the misunderstood businessman perfectly. He gave to charity, smiled for photographs, and lectured about the good old days. It was theater, and Los Angeles, the city built on illusion, rewarded him for it. Then came the fall. By the early 1960s, the FBI was done watching. The Internal Revenue Service came knocking, and the facade began to crack. Cohen faced multiple indictments: tax evasion, racketeering, and more. He served years in Alcatraz and other federal prisons. But even behind bars, his myth only grew. He claimed that other inmates treated him like a celebrity. He'd sign autographs, tell stories about Sinatra and Siegel, and boast that no one ever touched Mickey Cohen. When he was finally released in the 1970s, he was older, sicker, but still chasing fame. He appeared on talk shows, published a memoir, and tried to rewrite his own legend, insisting he was never really a gangster, just a businessman misunderstood by the law. Then in 1976, the final curtain fell. Cohen was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Some say it was natural. Others whispered that it wasn't, that old enemies had slipped something into his food in prison, ensuring he'd die slowly, painfully, and forgotten. He spent his last days in obscurity, far from the flashing bulbs and crowded nightclubs he once ruled. When he died, the city barely noticed. But those who remembered knew the truth. Mickey Cohen wasn't just a gangster. He was the man who taught Hollywood how to glamorize one. He turned crime into performance, blood into headlines, and fear into entertainment. And when he finally disappeared, Los Angeles didn't lose a criminal. It lost one of its greatest actors. Benjamin "Dopey" Benny Fine, the first mobster of show business. Long before Bugsy Siegel built his casino empire, long before Mickey Cohen became a tabloid sensation, there was Benjamin "Dopey" Benny Fine, the man who proved that Hollywood didn't invent corruption, it merely perfected it. At the dawn of the 20th century, New York City was a world of smoke and steel, of rising theaters and desperate workers. Broadway was booming, vaudeville was everywhere, and behind the laughter and applause, money moved quietly through darkened corridors. It was here, among the flashing marquees and chorus lines, that Dopey Benny made his fortune. Not from applause, but from fear. Fine wasn't a Hollywood mobster, he was its prototype. He understood something that would shape the next 100 years of entertainment. Whoever controls the workers controls the show. By the 1910s, he had taken over the labor unions that powered New York's theaters, stagehands, set builders, ticket takers. If producers didn't pay his protection fees, shows would mysteriously shut down, costumes would vanish, or lighting rigs would accidentally collapse before opening night. Directors paid, theater owners begged. Dopey Benny's word became law. He expanded his grip into film distribution. The silent era studios depended on his approval to move reels, rent theaters, or avoid union trouble. And just like that, the mob found its first foothold in American entertainment. Fine's power grew so immense that even Hollywood executives, 3,000 miles away, knew his name. The early film studios learned quickly, to do business in New York, you had to play by Benny's rules. He controlled strikes, riots, and negotiations like a puppet master, and every handshake came with an invisible threat. But power, as always, breeds arrogance. By the 1930s, the new generation of mobsters, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, saw Fine as an antique. He had paved the road they now ruled, and they no longer needed him. His empire began to crumble as rival factions turned on him. Then one night, as he walked home through the dim-lit streets of Manhattan, gunfire shattered the calm. Fine was ambushed, bullets tearing through his coat, leaving him bleeding in the gutter. He survived for a while, but the mob doesn't miss twice. Within months, he vanished completely from the public eye. Some said he was executed. Others claimed he had fled the country. The truth, like so many mob stories, was buried under decades of silence. Yet his legacy endured. Not in headlines, but in the system he built. Every time a studio executive made a deal under pressure, every time a performer signed a contract with invisible conditions, Dopey Benny's ghost hovered nearby. He had taught organized crime how to exploit entertainment, how to hide extortion behind elegance, and how to make money off other people's dreams. Before there was Hollywood glamour, there was Broadway fear. And standing at that crossroad, cigar in hand, ledger in pocket, was Dopey Benny Fine, the first man to prove that in show business, the real drama doesn't happen on stage. Dutch Schultz, the bootlegger who tried to rewrite the law. In the roaring 20s, while America danced and drank through Prohibition, few names struck fear and fascination quite like Dutch Schultz. He wasn't polished like Lucky Luciano or charming like Bugsy Siegel. He was raw power, wrapped in ambition and paranoia. With sharp eyes, a quick temper, and a reputation for violence, Schultz built one of the most profitable empires in the bootlegging world. But Schultz didn't just want money, he wanted control. He was the rare gangster who dreamed not of survival, but of rewriting the rules that kept him in danger. Operating out of New York, Dutch ran his liquor empire with military precision. His trucks moved faster than the cops could chase them, and his men delivered booze to speakeasies that lined the city like veins of liquid gold. Soon he expanded, taking over Harlem's numbers racket and squeezing protection money from nightclubs and theaters, many of which featured Hollywood's brightest touring stars. His influence crept into the entertainment world almost by accident. Jazz musicians, actors, and producers who worked the East Coast nightlife knew the same truth. If Dutch Schultz didn't approve, your show didn't open. But while the mob flourished in shadows, Schultz wanted legitimacy. He longed for recognition, for his name to be respected, not whispered. That craving for validation would destroy him. The government had been watching. U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey, a young, relentless prosecutor, built his career on taking down mobsters. And Dutch Schultz was his prize target. Raids, arrests, investigations. The pressure never stopped. And as the heat intensified, Schultz's paranoia grew. He became erratic, violent, unpredictable. His own men began to fear him. Then in a moment that sealed his fate, Schultz did the unthinkable. He announced that he would kill Dewey. To the other mob bosses, it was madness. Killing a federal prosecutor would bring the full weight of the U.S. government down on all of them. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, they all agreed. Dutch had become a liability. The commission, the Mafia's secret council, made its decision. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz sat in the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, having dinner with 3 of his men. He was loud, drunk, defiant, boasting about his next move. The door opened. 2 hitmen from Murder, Inc. entered. No one had time to scream. The air filled with gunfire. 40 bullets in under 10 seconds. Schultz was hit in the stomach and fell to the floor. His blood pooled around broken dishes and spilled wine. But somehow, impossibly, he didn't die right away. He lingered for 24 hours, raving incoherently in his hospital bed, muttering strange phrases, names, and half-formed sentences that detectives scrambled to record. His deathbed ramblings became legend, studied for decades, but they revealed nothing, only the haunted mind of a man trying to outtalk death itself. When he finally died, the underworld exhaled in relief. The danger had passed, but his story left a scar. For Hollywood, Schultz's fall showed just how fragile power really was. You could dine with stars, control nightclubs, and walk with kings, but the moment you defied the code, the mob would erase you like a scene cut from a script. Dutch Schultz wanted to change the rules. Instead, he proved the oldest one of all. Nobody rewrites the Mafia. Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of organized crime. If organized crime had a founding father, it was Charles Lucky Luciano. Before him, the Mafia was chaos, street wars, personal vendettas, disorganized greed. After him, it was an empire, structured, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Luciano didn't just survive the mob, he invented it. Born in Sicily in 1897, he grew up poor, ambitious, and unafraid. He understood people better than anyone, their desires, their weaknesses, their price. By his 20s, he was already running New York streets alongside names that would become legend. Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello. But what set Lucky apart was vision. While others fought over neighborhoods, Luciano dreamed of a corporation of crime, a national syndicate that operated like a business. He reorganized the old Sicilian families into what he called the Commission, a boardroom of bosses designed to prevent unnecessary bloodshed and maximize profit. It worked. The Mafia thrived under his structure. He became the CEO of the underworld, managing illegal gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and eventually Hollywood itself. Luciano understood the power of image. He mingled with movie stars, dated showgirls, and held meetings in hotels where directors and actors dined just tables away. He saw how films glorified gangsters, and he smiled because those films made him mythic. When the United States entered World War II, Luciano did something few could believe. He helped the government. Through a secret arrangement, he used his connections to secure New York's docks from Nazi saboteurs. In exchange, his prison sentence for racketeering was commuted. But the deal came with exile. In 1946, Luciano was deported to Italy. Yet even in exile, he ruled. From his suite in Naples, he entertained mobsters, businessmen, and, yes, Hollywood figures visiting Europe. He walked the streets freely, still impeccably dressed, still feared, still respected. To the outside world, he was retired. To those who knew, he was still pulling strings across oceans. But time catches everyone, even the men who write history. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at the Naples airport for a meeting with a film producer. The project? A movie based on his life. As he approached his guest with a smile, Luciano suddenly clutched his chest. He collapsed to the floor, dead from a heart attack. He was 64. Some said it was natural. Others whispered that he had been poisoned. Silence before he could reveal secrets that connected crime families to politicians, celebrities, and power brokers on both continents. No one ever proved it. But when word reached America, the reactions were mixed. To law enforcement, it was the end of an era. To Hollywood, it was the closing chapter of the greatest real-life gangster story ever told. Because everything that came after, The Godfather, Goodfellas, Scarface, Casino, all of it was built on Luciano's design. He didn't just influence the mob, he influenced the way we imagine the mob. Charles "Lucky" Luciano never held a camera, never wrote a script, never stood beneath studio lights. But his legacy became cinema's favorite illusion. Power without conscience, control without mercy, glamour without morality. He was the architect, and Hollywood built its myths from his blueprints. Joe Colombo and the shot heard across New York. By the early 1970s, the Mafia's golden age was beginning to crack. Old bosses were dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. The FBI was finally catching up. And the movies, The Godfather, Mean Streets, The French Connection, were no longer afraid to show what America had been too polite to see. It was the perfect storm. And at its center stood one man who refused to fade quietly. Joe Colombo. Unlike the cautious bosses before him, Colombo wanted to be seen. He wasn't content to pull strings from behind the curtain. He wanted the spotlight, the crowds, the cameras. As the head of the Colombo crime family, he ruled with charisma and calculation. But what made him different was how he disguised power as virtue. In 1970, he founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, claiming it was to combat negative stereotypes of Italians in the media. It was on the surface a noble cause. Speeches about equality, rallies against discrimination, calls for dignity. But beneath the slogans, Colombo was playing a dangerous game. The League became his stage. He spoke before thousands in New York, shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, and reporters who didn't dare question his motives. And when The Godfather went into production, Colombo publicly protested the film, claiming it would portray Italians unfairly. He demanded script changes. He threatened to shut down filming, And to everyone's surprise, he succeeded. Paramount's producers, desperate to avoid real-world conflict, met with Colombo's representatives. Soon after, nearly every mention of the word mafia was quietly removed from the script. For a brief moment, Joe Colombo had done the impossible. He had censored Hollywood itself. But power is a fragile illusion, and the mob never forgives those who bring too much attention. By turning himself into a celebrity, Colombo had broken the first rule of the mafia: stay invisible. On June 28, 1971, at a massive league rally in Columbus Circle, New York, Colombo stood before a cheering crowd of thousands. Cameras flashed, flags waved. He had just begun his speech when a man pushed through the barrier, a black man carrying a camera and press credentials. He raised it, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The gunfire echoed across the square. Colombo collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath his podium. The shooter was gunned down moments later by Colombo's bodyguards, dead before he could speak. Joe Colombo survived the initial attack, but he was gone in every other sense. He slipped into a coma, lingering for 7 years before dying in 1978. The assassination stunned America. For the first time, the mob's violence had played out in broad daylight, in front of cameras, in front of the people. It was a brutal reminder that the mafia, no matter how polished its image, was still ruled by the gun. For Hollywood, it was a moment of eerie reflection. While they filmed fictional stories about gangsters, the real ones were still spilling blood, even as their movies glorified them. After Colombo's shooting, The Godfather premiered to record-breaking acclaim. Audiences were mesmerized. Critics hailed it as art. And quietly, in back rooms across America, real mobsters smiled because the world was finally celebrating the myth they'd been living all along. Joe Colombo's death marked the end of an era and the beginning of something new. The mafia would fade from the streets, but not from the screen. Its power was no longer in fear, but in fascination. And as the cameras rolled and the lights dimmed, one question lingered in the air. If the mob could silence truth in public, how many lies still hid behind Hollywood's brightest lights? The next chapter would reveal the answer. Vito Genovese, the boss who tried to rule from a prison cell. If Lucky Luciano was the architect of organized crime, Vito Genovese was the man who tried to build an empire on his blueprints and nearly destroyed it in the process. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek fame or headlines, but everyone in the underworld knew his name, whispered it, even feared it. Because Genovese didn't simply want power, he wanted absolute control over every dollar, every deal, every man who dared to breathe within his territory. Born in Naples, raised in the streets of New York, Vito rose quickly through the ranks of Luciano's organization. He was cold, intelligent, and patient, a strategist in a world ruled by violence. While others craved attention, Genovese craved domination. He built alliances not through trust, but through terror. When he spoke, men listened. When he smiled, they wondered if it was their last day alive. To those beneath him, he was a king. To those beside him, he was a snake. When Luciano was deported, Genovese saw his chance. He moved in on the empire his old mentor left behind, tightening his grip on the Genovese crime family, which still bears his name today. He expanded operations into narcotics, extortion, labor unions, and even film distribution networks, a lucrative business that offered the mob both money and influence over what America watched. Hollywood by then had already felt the mob's quiet presence for decades, but under Genovese, that influence became colder, more transactional. Actors and producers who refused protection deals found their sets vandalized, their theaters sabotaged, their careers suddenly stalling. He understood something fundamental. Controlling the unions meant controlling the dream. By the late 1950s, the U.S. government finally came for him. After years of investigations, Genovese was convicted on federal narcotics charges, a crime he claimed he didn't commit. But even prison walls couldn't contain his ego. From his cell at Leavenworth, he continued to run his empire through coded letters, visiting lawyers and loyal soldiers. Inmates whispered that guards treated him like royalty. His meals delivered privately, his orders carried out far beyond those walls. He believed he could outlast the system, that death would come for others before it came for him. He was wrong. On February 14, 1969, Vito Genovese died in prison, officially of a heart attack. But even that ending carried its own mystery. Rumors persisted that he had been quietly poisoned, not by rivals outside, but by those closest to him. The same men who had once sworn loyalty, now hungry for the empire he left behind. The announcement of his death was brief. No grand funeral, no lavish memorial, just another old man gone. Yet his shadow remained enormous. The family he built still operates under his name, its power stretching quietly into industries he once sought to control. To this day, his name is spoken in reverence and fear. The ghost of a man who tried to rule from the inside and learned that no cage can hold ambition, but ambition can become its own cage. Hollywood would later echo his story in The Godfather Part 2, in Michael Corleone's Cold Detachment, in the lonely power of men who rule from glass towers and prison cells. Because what Genovese taught them, and the world, was that control without conscience always ends the same way, in silence. Tony Accardo, the quiet king who outlived them all. In the long, bloody chronicle of organized crime, no figure stands more mysteriously than Tony Big Tuna Accardo. He didn't seek fame. He didn't need headlines. He ruled the Chicago outfit for nearly half a century, and he did it by mastering one thing no gangster before him ever understood: silence. Accardo began humbly, a small-time enforcer during Al Capone's reign. He wasn't the loudest or the most feared, but he was the most observant. Where others chased glory, Accardo studied weakness. He watched Capone fall to the law, watched Nitti die by his own hand, watched empires collapse because men couldn't control their egos. And from those lessons, he crafted a single rule: talk less, kill once. When the old guard fell, Accardo quietly stepped in. By the 1940s, he was running Chicago's criminal machine, its casinos, its unions, its Hollywood rackets, with the precision of a businessman and the caution of a ghost. He preferred negotiation to murder, but when violence was necessary, it was absolute. He avoided the spotlight, rarely photographed, never arrested for violent crimes. He lived in a modest brick house in the suburbs, attended church, and sent his children to private schools. Neighbors called him polite. The FBI called him untouchable. Under his rule, the mob evolved into a financial empire. He diversified into legitimate businesses, expanded the mob's control over Las Vegas casinos, and restructured the outfit like a corporate entity. And while Hollywood continued to romanticize the Mafia, filling screens with gangsters modeled after his peers, Accardo simply smiled, knowing he was the only one still breathing. The legend of his vengeance became the stuff of whispered horror. When burglars once broke into his Chicago home, stealing jewelry and cash, their bodies were found days later, beaten, tortured, and mutilated beyond recognition. The message was unmistakable. The king might be quiet, but he was never weak. Unlike Capone, Nitti, or Giancana, Accardo died the way mobsters aren't supposed to, peacefully. No bullets, no betrayal, no spectacle. Just a heart that stopped beating one ordinary day in 1992 as he sat in his favorite chair, watching television. He was 86 years old, the last surviving link to the original dynasty that had tied the Mafia to Hollywood. To those who came after, he was a myth. To those who knew, he was proof that the real bosses were never in front of the cameras. They were the ones who let others play the roles, write the stories, and take the fall. Tony Accardo's greatest trick wasn't avoiding death. It was outliving history. When filmmakers later created their versions of The Last Don, when actors spoke of code and loyalty and quiet power, they were channeling him, the man who never had to shout to be obeyed. He understood something that Hollywood, for all its brilliance, rarely does. The dead make headlines. The survivors make history. Bugs Moran, the last rival of Capone. By the time George Bugs Moran entered the scene, Chicago had already become a battlefield. The streets reeked of gunpowder, the alleys whispered with bribes, and every warehouse was a front for someone else's empire. And standing across from Al Capone, the most feared man in America, was Moran, a stubborn Irishman who refused to kneel. If Capone was charm and calculation, Moran was fury and pride. He didn't see crime as business. He saw it as war. To him, the mob wasn't an organization. It was a fight for survival. The two men loathed each other. Their rivalry defined an era, a blood-soaked opera played out across the streets of Chicago during the height of Prohibition. Moran controlled the north side, Capone ruled the south, and between them stood an invisible wall of bullets. In those years, America was still learning how to love its criminals. Newspapers printed their photographs like movie stars. Hollywood began crafting characters inspired by them. Anti-heroes with style, violence, and twisted charisma. They became the first gangster celebrities of the modern age, long before Hollywood would fully adopt the genre. But in real life, there was nothing glamorous about what came next. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 of Moran's men gathered in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. They were unarmed, waiting for what they thought was a routine delivery of liquor. Moments later, 4 men entered, 2 in plain clothes, 2 in Chicago police uniforms. The officers lined Moran's men against the wall. Then, without a word, the machine guns opened fire. The massacre lasted less than a minute. When the smoke cleared, the walls dripped red, and 7 bodies lay twisted in the dust. It was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, one of the most infamous killings in American history. Moran survived by chance. He had been late to the meeting. When he saw the police cars outside, he turned back, unaware he was walking away from his own death. The massacre ended his empire. Public outrage forced police and the press to finally turn on Capone's organization. But it didn't matter. Moran's men were gone. His control shattered. He had lost the war, and with it, his purpose. In the years that followed, Moran drifted from one small scheme to another. He robbed banks, ran petty scams, and lived in cheap motels. The newspapers stopped printing his name. The cameras stopped flashing. The last of the old gangsters had become irrelevant in a new world ruled by corporate mobsters and cinematic myths. In 1957, he was arrested for armed robbery and sent to prison. There, forgotten by history, Bugs Moran died of lung cancer, his name a footnote in the story he once dominated. But his legend endured, not because of who he was, but because of what his war inspired. The Valentine's Day Massacre became a symbol of organized crime's cruelty, a template for every gangster film that followed. It was reenacted on sound stages, replayed in slow motion, romanticized for decades. Hollywood turned Moran's defeat into art, and in doing so, transformed real blood into box office gold. He may have lost everything in life, but in death, Bugs Moran became eternal. The face of the fallen, the rival who never surrendered, the ghost behind every bullet-riddled scene we still watch today. Because in the end, it wasn't Al Capone's empire that lived forever. It was the story, and every story needs its tragic rival, the hand that still directs the spotlight. The credits of the Golden Age have long since rolled. The studios that once shaped dreams are now corporations. The stars who once ruled the screen have become legends, frozen in black and white. And yet, the story hasn't truly ended. For decades, Hollywood has sold the illusion of control, that success comes from talent, hard work, or luck. But behind the glitter, behind every casting call and contract dispute, there remains something older and colder. The hidden hand. It no longer wears a fedora or carries a gun. It signs checks, manipulates markets, and buys silence. The methods have evolved, but the principle remains the same. Influence traded in shadows, favors paid in whispers. From the 1930s to the present, the mob's fingerprints have been wiped away, but never erased. Their power reshaped industries, rewrote careers, and defined the boundaries of ambition. Bugsy Siegel turned the desert into a city of sin. Virginia Hill paid the price for knowing too much. Sam Giancana died with secrets that could have rewritten history. Frank Nitti took his own life rather than confess. Tony Accardo learned how to rule forever by saying nothing at all, and Loretta Young survived by perfecting the art of silence long after the bullets stopped flying. They were all bound by the same unspoken truth. In Hollywood, fame was a spotlight, and whoever controlled the light controlled the story. Even today, when films romanticize their world, when audiences cheer for fictional mobsters and anti-heroes, they are applauding ghosts. The men and women who once turned real lives into tragedies so compelling that art could never look away. Every time the opening credits roll, every time the camera pans across a glittering skyline, the echo remains. The deals made in hotel rooms, the envelopes passed under tables, the promises sealed not with ink, but with fear. And as long as Hollywood exists, as long as dreams can be bought and stories can be owned, the hand that shaped it will never truly disappear. Because power doesn't die, it adapts, it evolves, it hides behind new faces, new corporations, new kinds of control. The mob is no longer here in name, but its design, its structure, its code, still beats beneath the city's heart. You can hear it in the negotiations that happen off record, in the quiet blacklists that ruin careers, in the fear that keeps people from speaking even now. A century later, the question remains unchanged. Who really controls the story? The answer has always been the same: those who stand in the dark, adjusting the spotlight.